March 12, 1945. The air was thick with uncertainty as a slow convoy of trucks rolled through the gates of an American prisoner of war camp in the Deep South, carrying men who had spent years being taught to fear this exact moment. Inside the wooden truck beds sat German soldiers of the Wehrmacht, their uniforms worn thin by retreat and defeat, their faces hardened by months of propaganda that promised pain, humiliation, and revenge at the hands of the enemy. Many clenched their fists. Others stared at the floorboards. A few whispered prayers. Nearly all were certain of one thing. Whatever waited them on American soil would be far worse than the battlefield they had just left behind. For these men, the war had already taken everything familiar. They had crossed Europe under orders they barely understood, watched cities burn under Allied bombs, and seen comrades disappear into forests, snowdrifts, and shallow graves. By the time they were captured, often during the chaotic final months after the Allied landings in Normandy, hunger had become constant and sleep a luxury. Capture itself was terrifying, but survival instincts told them it was preferable to dying nameless in a ditch. Still, surrendering to the Americans carried its own dread. Years of Nazi indoctrination had painted a vivid picture of brutal captivity, beatings, starvation, forced labor, and revenge for the destruction Germany had unleashed upon the world. That fear did not come from nowhere. German soldiers had been warned relentlessly by officers, pamphlets, and newsreels that the enemy was barbaric. The Eastern Front had proven those warnings frighteningly real, and stories of Soviet captivity spread like wildfire through the ranks. American soldiers, the propaganda claimed, were no different, only more deceptive. They would smile, it said, and then punish. They would offer kindness only to humiliate. Many prisoners believed they would be executed outright or worked to death in distant camps. As the truck slowed and guards barked orders in accented German, hearts pounded with the expectation of cruelty. Instead, what greeted them was silence. No shouting mobs, no raised rifle butts, just rows of wooden barracks behind barbed wire, American flags fluttering lazily above guard towers, and soldiers who seemed almost bored with the entire process. Orders were given calmly. Names were recorded. Weapons were taken. The prisoners were searched, not violently, but methodically, with an efficiency that felt strange to men accustomed to screaming officers and constant threats. One young corporal from Bavaria later recalled thinking that something was wrong, that this calm was merely the prelude to something far worse. The historical path that led these men to America stretched back years. By late 1944, the Western Allies faced an unexpected problem. As Allied armies pushed across France and into Germany, hundreds of thousands of Axis soldiers surrendered. Britain, already battered by bombing and shortages, lacked the resources to house them all. The United States, relatively untouched at home and rich in land and infrastructure, offered a solution. Beginning in 1943 and accelerating after D-Day, German prisoners were transported across the Atlantic in converted troop ships, guarded carefully, but treated according to the Geneva Convention. By the war's end, more than 370,000 German POWs would be held in camps scattered across nearly every American state. The journey itself was an ordeal. Packed into ships under tight security, prisoners expected submarine attacks, disease, or worse. Some ships were indeed torpedoed, and rumors of men drowning in chains spread quickly among the captives. But for many, the crossing passed uneventfully, marked more by boredom and seasickness than fear. When land finally appeared, it was not the ruined coastline of Europe they expected, but wide American harbors, bustling with activity, untouched by war. The sight alone unsettled them. This was a nation fighting a global war without seeing its cities reduced to rubble. From the ports, trains carried the prisoners deep inland, to Texas, Alabama, Arkansas, Arizona, and beyond. They passed endless fields, quiet towns, and factory complexes humming with production. Some prisoners pressed their faces to the windows, astonished. Others refused to look, convinced it was all a carefully staged illusion. Yet the scale of America's resources was impossible to deny. Everything seemed larger, newer, more abundant. For men who had grown up rationing bread and fuel, it felt like stepping into another world. Life inside the camps began with strict routines. Roll calls were held morning and evening. Guards patrolled the fences. Escape attempts, though rare, were punished with isolation. But beyond that, conditions defied expectation. The barracks were heated. Medical care was available. Mail from home, though delayed, was delivered. Most shocking of all was the food. American rations were plentiful and, by wartime standards, luxurious. Bread was white and soft. Meat appeared regularly. There was coffee, real coffee, not the bitter substitutes common in Germany. And then there was the chocolate. Chocolate had become a symbol of American abundance long before the war. U.S. soldiers carried it in their rations, and its reputation had spread across Europe. German soldiers had heard stories of Americans trading chocolate for favors, using it casually, almost carelessly. Still, many prisoners believed they would never see such things. When the first mess tins were handed out and a square of chocolate sat beside the meal, disbelief rippled through the line. Some thought it was a trick. Others saved it, waiting to see if punishment followed. None came. One sergeant from Hamburg later described holding the chocolate in his hand for several minutes, turning it over as if it might vanish. "They give us this," he whispered to a fellow prisoner. "After everything?" The question hung heavy in the barracks that night. Men who had braced themselves for suffering instead found themselves fed better than they had been in years. The contrast was disorienting. Guilt mingled with relief. Suspicion warred with gratitude. As weeks turned into months, the camps developed their own rhythms. Many prisoners were assigned to labor details, working on farms, repairing roads, or cutting timber. Under the Geneva Convention, they could not be forced to do war-related work, but agricultural labor was permitted and badly needed. American farmers, short of manpower due to the draft, relied heavily on POW labor. Guards supervised from a distance, often armed but relaxed. Conversations, once unthinkable, slowly began. Broken English met hesitant German. At first, exchanges were purely practical. Over time, they grew personal. The cultural shock ran deep. Prisoners were stunned by American informality. Guards called officers by first names. Discipline existed, but without the constant brutality many Germans considered normal. Some guards were veterans of North Africa or Italy, men who had seen combat and lost friends. They carried their own resentments, but official policy demanded restraint, and most followed it. A few even showed kindness, sharing newspapers, explaining baseball rules, or answering questions about life beyond the fence. Inside the camps, prisoners organized themselves. Choirs formed. Orchestras played using improvised instruments. Classes were held, languages, mathematics, even philosophy. For some, it was the first time they had engaged in open discussion without fear of denunciation. Nazi hardliners initially tried to enforce ideology within the camps, intimidating others and organizing secret courts. American authorities responded by separating these men, transferring them to isolated facilities. The result was an unexpected loosening of fear. Many prisoners began to think freely for the first time in years. The emotional turning point often came quietly. For one former schoolteacher from Cologne, it arrived during a letter-writing session. He sat at a rough wooden table, pen in hand, struggling to explain to his wife that he was alive, safe, and, most astonishing of all, well-fed. He hesitated before writing the truth, afraid she would not believe him. How could he explain that the enemy he had been taught to hate had given him chocolate and medical care? That he slept in a clean bed while Germany burned? The realization filled him with shame, relief, and confusion all at once. Conversations between prisoners revealed similar turmoil. At night, after lights out, whispers traveled the barracks. Men debated whether this treatment was genuine or merely temporary. Some argued it was propaganda, a way to weaken their resolve. Others admitted, reluctantly, that it was changing them. "If this is America," one private murmured, "then everything we were told was a lie." No one answered him, but many lay awake, staring into the darkness, thinking the same thought. As the war in Europe neared its end, news trickled into the camps. The fall of Berlin, Hitler's death, Germany's unconditional surrender. For many prisoners, The announcements landed with a dull finality rather than shock. The war had already ended for them months earlier, in a muddy field or shattered village. Yet the reality of defeat brought new fears. What would happen now? Would they be punished for the crimes of the regime? Would they be sent home to ruins, or kept indefinitely behind wire? American policy remained largely consistent. Camps stayed orderly. Food did not disappear. In some cases, educational programs expanded, aimed at denazification and preparation for civilian life. Prisoners watched American films, read newspapers, and listened to lectures on democracy. Reactions varied. Some dismissed it as indoctrination. Others listened intently, comparing it to what they had known. The contrast was unavoidable. Personal stories multiplied. A former Luftwaffe mechanic befriended an elderly American farmer whose sons were fighting in the Pacific. They worked side by side in the fields, communicating through gestures and broken phrases. One afternoon, during a break, the farmer shared a homemade sandwich and a piece of chocolate. The mechanic accepted it silently. Years later, he would recall that moment as the first time he felt the war's hatred truly begin to loosen its grip. Not all interactions were warm. Tension flared at times, especially when news of concentration camps reached the camps. Some guards confronted prisoners angrily. Some prisoners insisted they had known nothing. Others admitted partial truths. The atmosphere grew heavy with unspoken questions of guilt and responsibility. Yet even then, official restraint held. Violence remained rare. The camps did not become places of vengeance, despite every reason they could have. As 1946 approached, repatriation began. One by one, camps emptied. Prisoners were transported back across the Atlantic, this time carrying memories that would follow them for the rest of their lives. They returned to a Germany shattered beyond recognition, cities flattened, families displaced, futures uncertain. Many spoke little of their captivity at first, fearing disbelief or resentment. Who would want to hear that the enemy had treated them well while civilians at home starved? Yet the memories lingered. Years later, former prisoners would describe America not as a place of punishment, but of profound contradiction. They had expected torture and humiliation. Instead, they encountered order, restraint, and unexpected humanity. Chocolate became a symbol, not of luxury, but of a moment when hatred paused and assumptions collapsed. History often records wars through battles and treaties, through maps and casualty figures. But the quiet transformation that occurred behind barbed wire in distant camps tells another story. It is a story of men shaped by ideology, confronting a reality that did not fit what they had been taught. Of enemies discovering, uneasily, that cruelty was not inevitable. In the end, those German prisoners carried more than memories back to Europe. They carried questions about obedience, truth, and the nature of power. Some would later play roles in rebuilding a democratic Germany. Others would simply tell their children and grandchildren that once, in the middle of history's most destructive war, they expected torture and were given chocolate instead.